Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank all of you for coming to this discussion on Malaysian higher education on the topic of Malaysia Beyond Student Hub. I'm Changda. I'm moderating this discussion. And today with us, we have colleagues who have been working on the topic of education hub, internationalization of higher education in Malaysia specifically, but also in the larger context, who has an interest on the concept of education hub. As we all know, in Malaysia, the vision of our National Higher Education Strategic Plan in 2007 has positioned or aspired for Malaysia to be an international education hub. At that time, the country made a very ambitious target of trying to achieve 100,000 international students to be enrolled in Malaysian higher education institutions by the year 2015. And that ambition was subsequently carried on into the Malaysian Education Blueprint, the Higher Education Blueprint 2015 to 2025, where the target of international students has been further extended to 200,000 in the year 2020, as well as 250,000 international students by the year 2025. Before we were all hit by this COVID pandemic, the latest figures that we have officially from the Ministry of Higher Education in 2019, there were 34,556 international students enrolled across the 20 public universities of Malaysia, as well as there's 59,013 students being enrolled in the private higher education institutions in Malaysia. So in total, in the year 2019, the total international students that is enrolled in our institutions were 93,569. So that is quite a big difference from the aspiration of having 200,000 by the year 2020, and this is the pre-COVID figure. And part of our discussion this afternoon is also looking at what would be that current situation that we should be mindful of, and what would be the future aspiration and the discussion around this concept of education hub. And today with us, we have two guests beside colleagues from associated to IPPTN. We have Jana from Germany, who has worked on the concept of education hub, as well as who also part of that study also looks at Malaysia as one of the case study. Perhaps Jana, you may want to start off by sharing a little bit of your work and also your the perspective that you carry in looking at this concept of education hub.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. And I should say that I come as an outsider to this conversation on many levels. And what I will share is basically taking a step back in many ways from the deeper engagement all of you in the room have probably with this topic. But I hope that this can be also helpful then in thinking through strategically what are future directions or future steps. And so when I say I come at this as an outsider, I should first say that I'm an economic geographer. So I'm not a higher education or education policy scholar by background. But I'm interested in processes of globalization, on the interactions between globalization, global actors, multinational corporations, but also local actors in this process. And a second part of my expertise is on urban development, and cities and how cities change, basically. So this is a very disciplinary, a very different view, I think, from many people engaged in these debates. And then secondly, I'm obviously an outsider to Malaysia. So it's, as Changda said, I've been to Malaysia, I conducted a case study there, but what I can share more broadly is kind of what I found surprising, maybe in the context of Malaysia, when I look at it through the lens of the other experiences that I had. And I hope these thoughts can be useful in this regard. So I'm based at the Leibniz Institute for Research on Society and Space in Erkner, that's just outside of Berlin. And we're a non-university research institute. And I got a major grant that allowed us with 3 PhD students for 5 years to conduct a major project on, it's called Constructing Transnational Spaces of Higher Education. And with this, we're primarily looking at transnational education and specifically international branch campuses. So when I will talk about the hub concept, it's mainly through this lens of international branch campuses, because that also relates to my expertise, is thinking these through as economic actors that invest in certain places. And of course, higher education is always and should always be more than just an economic sector. But I think this kind of analysis can also open our view to sort of a different understanding in many regards. And so with this research project that started in 2018, we looked at the sending institutions perspective, mainly from Europe. So why would they decide on certain locations? What are their strategies? Because I think they do play a role when it comes into what these actors can or cannot deliver or want to deliver in a certain place. And then we looked from the host perspective on Malaysia, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar as cases that we zoomed in more in depth. I don't know if you want me to go on now in terms of actually talking about the hub concept, or maybe we can bring Jack on board.
Yep, we will come back to that a little bit, and perhaps you can help to enlighten us a little bit in terms of the differences that you see the Malaysian example of hubs as with the other 3 that you talk about later. But we also have with us Jack, who his PhD was actually about education hub, if I'm not mistaken, and Malaysia is one of the case that you look at in your PhDs. And subsequently, I also know that you were here doing fieldwork at the height of when this whole when the whole concept of education hub was really at the central of our policy discourse in Malaysia. So perhaps Jack, you may want to share with us a little bit your thoughts and what have came out from that PhD project and your subsequent work in relation to this hub.
Great to see everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join this panel. I did my PhD at the University of Toronto looking at 3 hubs. My particular interest is in comparative higher education. So I knew I did not want to look at a single hub as a case study. So it focused on Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The data collection was 2012 to 2014. So certainly many of you in this room would know the more up-to-date information of what is happening in Malaysia. But I continue to keep an eye out on what is going on, particularly in Southeast Asia. My interest is in looking at internationalization beyond merely, I would say, student mobility. I think it is a broader concept, and we become very obsessed with student numbers. And there's a lot more going on, such as Jana says, you know, the whole IBC situation that continues to develop, you know, despite whatever comes out of student numbers. I can certainly say without hesitation, data collection in 3 places. I had the most fun in Malaysia. I met a lot of fascinating people who were extremely warm and welcoming. So I have very strong memories of doing work in Malaysia compared to the other 2 places.
If not for COVID, we would have invited you to come over.
Oh, I would love to. I was there for the Going Global by British Council like a year or 2 ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago, 2019.
Yes, yes. So I think I would, my other issue with the entire hub concept is to think beyond policy rhetoric. I mean, Changda alluded to that in the beginning. There is a layer of policy going on. Yes, it may be stuck in 2007 or 2008, but there's another layer of actual activities happening, right? And they're not always connected. So I'm very also interested in the Middle East, have not done work there, but certainly given the huge development of transnational higher education. It's another vibrant area. So thank you.
Yeah. At this point, Jasvir, Doria, anything you want to add on to that?
Still listening in at the moment. Sorry for coming in late. By the way, I just finished a training. Nothing from me yet. Just
okay. All right. So any points, just feel free to come into the conversation. All right. Perhaps maybe let's start by talking a little bit about what I mean. Both of you, Jana and Jack, were taking very much a comparative perspective to the whole concept of hub, and perhaps I think Jana also very rightly talked about in my own work recently with another colleague in Hong Kong who so happened was writing about transnational education and in partial relations to that whole discussion of hub on Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, is that specifically in the case of Malaysia, that concept of hub, there is actually two very subtle but different distinction or ways in which the whole concept of education hub was playing out. One was like what Jack talks about, it is very much centered on a policy rhetoric, focusing on international students. But there is actually another sort of hub that was being talked about in the late 2000s, going into the early 2010, is that concept of an education area, what they call the KL, the Klang Valley Education, EduCity is another example down in Johor. But before that was there was a township just outside of Kuala Lumpur that has been identified as the area where an education hub, the physical education hub, is supposed to be built on. And subsequently in your work in Malaysia and in comparative to both the other 3 or 4 countries that you look at, is there anything different in the way you found about the way that Malaysia is talking about education hub that is different from what other countries are talking about? Maybe Jana, you want to start?
I can start. I would, as I said before, probably take a step back and think about the concept of education hub at large, and then maybe we can together zoom in a bit on the case of Malaysia. When I started this work, I always start my work with a puzzle or being surprised with something. And for me, the notion of the education hub was extremely fuzzy when I tried to understand it. What does it mean? And it seems it's a carrier of imagination, especially for policymakers, and it enables them to put in a lot of different things and strategies underneath. And scholars who have looked at the concept, and Jane Knight particularly has coined definitions on it and trying to look at sort of differentiating between different kinds of hub, talent hub, student hub, research hub, and so on, and then classifying different countries into it. When I read that work, on one level it made sense because it was trying to grapple with quite a complex phenomena that works differently in different places. But as a geographer, I had a huge stomach ache with the lack of scale or the fuzziness of scale within that. And that, Chang, that is what you just spoke about, that sometimes we talk about entire nation states as being a hub. In other cases, we talk about very small sort of urban areas that are zoned off as being an education hub. And so to me, it seemed that we need to at least distinguish between these two phenomena in order to get a better understanding of what we're actually talking about. And if we think of the concept of the hub, what does a hub mean, right? It's a node within a network. Could be one definition. So in however we think of it, I think it makes sense that it serves as a focal point of different, let's say, global mobilities coming together. whether that's students, but that could be only one of it. It would also be mobilities of ideas or capital or labor or faculty in that sense when we talk about labor, of institutions that come together. And so through my own work, I primarily looked at education hubs being built around and drawing particularly strongly on transnational universities, and so international branch campuses. And that's how we then thought of a different definition. So we didn't in the paper I wrote together with my colleagues that took a comparative angle. We didn't so much look at the national scale of policy making for transnational education, which I think this we could discuss, things of it as an economic sector, and in terms of the students will be the customers that can be brought in. So the question of what is the hub? It's about bringing in international students. And then the question is it to domestic institutions, or are the institutions also to be brought in? And once that is the model, it becomes very complex, of course, because you have to bring in different actors from outside. And the question is, what does your local place offer as in terms of being able to actually attract these? What is the key contribution there, and why does it need to be in a particular location? I think if we look at the Middle East, the point is being that they are at a mobilities hub with the airlines, a strategic location where people travel through, and that kind of, and the fact that there's a lot of financial resources that are able to bring in these different actors. And I think that strategy, not every place in the world is able to do what Qatar did, for instance, because there's a question of financial resources right there. So when we looked and critiqued the concept of the education hub, we primarily look at what's also called education cities. So we looked at what EduCity would be in Malaysia, and that is more on the urban or at the regional level. And there we came up with a definition that kind of isn't at the level of the hub, and it doesn't involve the terminology of the hub, but it really thinks of it as a zone. So as a transnational education zone, where the idea is to cluster different international branch campuses, or we call them offshore campuses, so they can have different forms and shapes. And so there we highlight the territorial character that's often classified by sort of zoning exceptions, foreign direct investment attractions, very similar in many ways to the concept of the special economic zone.
Yep.
And so the transnational education zone to me is one of the elements for trying to build a knowledge economy through economic development strategies and foreign direct investment strategies. And it revolves centrally also around the idea of clustering, I would say. And so that, for me, is one of the surprising and interesting tensions. And of course, with the idea of clustering, it is you have, let's say, we think of a different sector, we think of textiles or automotive industry, and then you have all of the suppliers that need to be geographically co-located. And so they together can come up with better ways of producing a certain commodity. Now, if you do the same thing with higher education institutions, the question is, can we logically assume that there will be this collaboration occurring necessarily? Or are they actually seeing each other as competitors for the same number of consumers? So in this sense, students who will enroll. And so I think that to me is a strategic thing to think about. If we borrow, or I would think it connects to previous strategies of economic development, then of course we need to keep thinking about what makes higher education special and different. And can we actually treat it the same way as we were to treat multinational corporations coming in? So those are a few first thoughts on the concept itself.
Yep. We will come back to that in a little while, talking about that economic grouping and the whole concentration of educational institutions trying to mirror an industry kind of discussion. That is very much what geographers are very interested in looking at. But we will discuss the education implications to that. But before that, I'll maybe bring in Jack a little bit into this discussion. You look at the comparative towards the east of Malaysia, so to speak, looking at Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, which is slightly different from the focus that Jana was looking at.